Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT ranked meta video. Today will be our last video for set 3, but don't worry, set 4 is just around the corner. But for now, let's focus on the overall ranked meta for set 3. We'll be talking about the various meta trends from the early, mid, and late game, including items, leveling, economy, champions, and playstyles. To end with, we'll briefly talk about Galaxies and how they impacted the game. With all that said, let's jump on in. But before we get back to the video, don't forget to click the links on our description. We have a giveaway going on right now to celebrate our 10,000 subscribers. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video, and to start off, let's talk about the early game, beginning with items. Set 3 in general has had a fairly diverse item meta. There's been a large amount of choices that players can make over the course of the set, but there's definitely been a few components and items that stand out above the others. For starters, there's 3 components that have influenced the game quite a bit. These 3 have almost always been high priority when it comes to the carousel, and there's one component that, well, has always been the lowest. The 3 highest priority components on the carousel are sword, tier, and glove. The lowest is, as you can probably guess, cloak. Of course, belt, rod, chain vest, and bow shouldn't be ignored, as they always have had a place in the meta as well. Belt was highly prioritized when Warmogs was valuable for protectors. The rod always has use in the meta, whether it was for Ionic Spark, Deathcap, Morellonomicon, or one of its biggest influences, the Demolitionist charge. Bow has primarily been a secondary component, but it's had its time in the sun as well, as rapid fire cannon was a necessity during the Slash Bros meta. Lastly, chain vest was a top defensive component for set 3, as it was used to make Guardian Angel, Shroud, Bramble Vest, and several other useful items over the course of the set. Let's get back to the main 3, starting with sword. Throughout set 3, the one item sword has consistently been used for is Guardian Angel. GA has had such an influence on the game that it will go down as the best defensive item. Other items made from sword with a big impact on the game include Giant Slayer, Infinity Edge, and Deathblade. Basically, all the non-Guardian Angel items were used as physical damage to carries like Jinx, Kale, Shaco, Aurelia, Jhin, and Vayne. Next is the sparring glove. Surprisingly, Thieves' Gloves were not that useful in set 3. Sure, it was good if you had the extra components, and it did have a lot of use in cybernetics, but overall it was surprisingly less useful than in previous sets. Glove had so many other useful items it made into. Defensively, both Trapclaw and Quicksilver saw play, though they fell in and out of the meta depending on the balance changes to them and whether or not Mech was doing well. Shroud of Stillness became a hugely impactful item, and all 3 of those items provided a crucial stat: dodge. On the offensive side, there's of course Infinity Edge, but the big game changer for set 3 was Last Whisper due to the amount of armor that there was in the front line, specifically coming from Vanguards. And the last component is Tier. Tier may or may not go down as the most influential component of set 3 purely because Blue Buff, which was originally known as Seraphs. Chalice of Favor also had a time in the meta before being removed from the game, as it created a mana battery style of play with Sona and other low mana pool champions. But Double Tier really took over for set 3 because it was so good on champions like Ziggs, Kai'Sa, Teemo, Cassiopeia, and Syndra. Overall, it was good for many champions, but Syndra is the one we're focusing on, as it made Star Guardian sorcerers really shine. The item truly affected the game in big ways, considering they had to remake it to be unique and nerf the tier itself. Overall, there's a lot that you could do with items in set 3. Spatula was much more balanced as well, besides a few outliers like the Demolitionist Kai'Sa. We look forward to seeing how the item meta plays out in set 4. Okay, it's now time to move on and talk about champions and traits for the early game. Of course, it needs to be stated that the meta always favored playing your strongest board, meaning 2-starring your champions over specific traits. But there are a few we should talk about that influence the game. Cybernetics and Rebels were by far the most commonly played early game traits, and they almost always did well regardless of the meta. Lucian, Fiora, and Leona made for an easy foundation to build from for Cybernetics. For Rebels, you had the duo of Ziggs plus Malphite, with any 2-cost Rebel as the third. Rumble also had a huge role in the early game, as the pairing of Ziggs plus Rumble was hard to beat. Space Pirates and Vanguards also did well, but they weren't anywhere close to the level of consistency as Cybernetics and Rebels. In terms of champions, it really depended on the meta. Ziggs, Twisted Fate, and at times Xayah were all great early 1-cost carries. Lucian was definitely the most consistent 2-cost carry of the set, with Ahri being a little bit behind him. After the mid-season update, it became common to play early 3-cost champions like Ashe, Jace, Cassiopeia, and Bard. Bard possibly had the largest influence on the early game as he provided additional experience that accelerated a player's board and economy. He was by far the most unique champion that the game has had. And the last early game section is leveling and economy. We won't go over each individual meta of Set 3, but instead talk in broader strokes. The overall meta of Set 3's early game quickly became fast-paced and aggressive for a few reasons. One, there was less early game gold. This is due to less gold dropping from boxes, no 2-cost carries from the first carousel, and being unable to sell during the carousel rounds. This meant building an economy was difficult, so playing to win streak was often the best play. And win streaking was often done by leveling early and looking to 2-star as much of your board as possible. Win streaking in general was the best way to play Set 3's early game. Lose streaking was possible, but much worse as econ was slower and you no longer were guaranteed items on the carousel, as the carousels were incredibly randomized. So again, leveling aggressively and even pre-leveling on 2-4 became the norm. While staying low level and rolling was a strategy, it was much less common than leveling and finding higher cost champions. Overall, 1 and 2 cost champions in Set 3 were primarily used for their traits and as filler units. The biggest impact came from finding 3 and 4 cost units. Thus, leveling early and aggressively was the most common meta. Alright, let's move on to the mid game. In general, the timings for leveling were relatively standard for the mid game. Level 6 on 3-2, level 7 by 4-1, and you could fast 8 on 4-3. Of course, there were a lot of nuances to timings, but the standard rounds at which you would level never really changed too drastically. Playstyles affected the meta much more than leveling times did. Overall, the playstyle that defines Set 3 is re-rolling. Primarily, we're talking about slow rolling, meaning hitting 50 gold and rolling excess gold, but there were a few builds that could be hyper rolled. The most popular, of course, was Zaya carry in the Shredder build, but for a time we also saw Candyland do well with Poppy as the carry. But hyper rolling was almost always inferior to slow rolling, even for low-cost builds. Rerolling quickly became the meta straight out of the gate for Set 3 and persisted the whole set. Level 5 compositions that slow rolled included Shredder, Protectors, and Candyland. Mech Infiltrator was the most common reroll build at level 6. Level 7 had a lot of builds that you could reroll for, including Slash Bros, Star Guardian Sorcerer, and Vanguard Mystic. Basically, the meta favored rerolling to find 3-star champions. This was easier prior to the mid-season update as there were less champions, but it was still a common playstyle after the update. Set 3 also saw a lot of builds focused around 5-cost champions. This meant leveling to 8 quickly, and in certain metas, leveling to 9 quickly was often the goal if possible. It was difficult to do, but if you had a good economy and high enough health, it was common to play this way. Builds like Cybernetics, Rebels, and later on, the Protector Legendaries comp were often seen playing this way. All in all, the meta was quite diverse through Set 3, though there were definitely times that it got stale, like when mech was too dominant. A huge reason for the diversity of Set 3 and what helped keep it fresh was the mid-season update. It introduced a lot of new champions and traits and had its own share of specific builds like Vanguard Mystic and Astro Sniper. So while the meta wasn't always the best for Set 3, as a whole, it was great. And the last stage to talk about is, of course, the late game. While we did just praise Set 3 for having a diverse meta, it has to be stated that the end game for Set 3 was less than stellar. It rarely changed over the course of the set, as the primary focus was either hitting a 3-star champion or just playing an abundance of legendary units. Mayhaps this is just what the late game is for TFT as a whole, but not much about Set 3 altered this at all. Of course, it does need to be said that the 5-cost meta was super good for this set. Most of them had a big impact on the game, and you'd almost always want 1 or 2 legendaries in your endgame comp. Most notably was Thresh, who really broke the late game by pulling in additional champions from your bench. He wasn't meta initially, but once players got better at the set, they realized that, hey, having a champion pull in more units is kinda good. Level 9 was interesting in Set 3 because it wasn't always attainable, nor was it always desired. With rerolling being such a common playstyle, it was difficult for builds to even have the gold to level to 9, and instead the trend of rolling to hit 3-star champions became more of the norm. Sure, level 9 was still the overall late game goal, but getting your carry to level 3 was also a win condition. Beyond leveling in champions, there was also a big emphasis on positioning for Set 3. You had to worry about a ton of crowd control and AoE. Even carries often did a lot of AoE damage like Kale, Jinx, Teemo, Vel'Koz, and Kai'Sa. Mech was a huge part of Set 3, and positioning around it was often key. Then you had specific things to worry about, such as Blitzcrank, Shroud, and Infiltrators. The late game for Set 3 was definitely the most difficult so far in regards to positioning. Positioning well in scouting often resulted in far more wins than anything else in the late game. Our last section for today is on Galaxies. Overall, the set mechanic of Set 3, Galaxies, will likely go down as interesting, but not amazing. That said, in the latter parts of the set, we saw the potential for this mechanic, as a good portion of the Galaxies were fun and added more positives to the game than negatives. But too often, the Galaxies took away player agency in the game by limiting what they could do. Galaxies like Binary Star, Dwarf Planet, and Little Legends are definitely up there for this. These Galaxies made the game less fun, and while they had interesting quirks about them, they detracted from the overall experience of the game. The other side of the coin were the Galaxies that gave players too much of an advantage. Galaxies like Star Cluster, Nicoverse, and the biggest culprit, Lilac Nebula. They made it so players that high rolled often got ahead of the pack by a large amount. While it was fun for those specific players, it definitely was less so for the rest of the lobby. But it's not all doom and gloom for this mechanic. They released quite a few interesting and fun Galaxies that made the game feel better. Treasure Trove was the best by far, as it injected more gold and items into the game. Plunder Planet was also similar, and of course the last Galaxy, the Big Bang, was just a combination of several Galaxies. Trade Sector, Manatee's Delight, and Salvage World were great for giving the player more choices to make. There were also changes made to existing Galaxies that improved them greatly. Galactic Armory went from one of the worst to one of the best by simply making the drops being components instead of full items. Super Dense was originally super not fun because it forced players to level early, but after tying to the stage, it became much better. Basically, Galaxies as a whole was often more of a hindrance than a boon for the meta. At best, it was just a normal game with a few more choices, and at worst, you were fighting against extreme odds. That said, it will be interesting to see a Galaxy-like mechanic added on a much smaller scale, as it definitely has the potential to be a positive for the game. Alright folks, that is it for today's video. And as we mentioned, this is our last video for Set 3. Overall, it has been a great set and should help make Set 4 even better. Let us know in the comments section below, what were your favorite moments of Set 3 and what are you looking forward to in Set 4? We'd like to thank you all for supporting us through Set 3, and we hope you'll continue to do so going into Set 4. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.